Okay, well, I'm showing 7 o'clock, and so I believe in getting started on time. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I know we'll have probably a few more people joining us as we go along. But I'd like to say welcome everybody to our second Power Up, focused on electricity generation. I'm Lori Benson, chair of the Climate Action Team at First-Plymouth Congregational Church. This evening, we're honored to have John Hay to give an overview of solar generation, followed by Marc Shkolnick briefing us on solar installation incentives and tips for hiring a reputable contractor. You may be wondering, why is a church group hosting a program on electricity generation? It's this simple. If we care about God's people and planet, we have to understand and reconsider how we generate electricity. John Hay is a University of Nebraska Extension Educator focused on energy issues and has taught about solar feasibility and economic analysis since 2012. John installed his own solar array at his home in 2017. Marc Shkolnick has served as manager of energy services for Lincoln Electric System for more than 15 years. Together with a customer-focused staff, his department provides comprehensive support for the community's residential, small commercial, and industrial customers on issues ranging from energy efficiency and customer-owned renewables to emerging technologies. John will be the first presenter for roughly 30 minutes, followed by Marc for roughly 15 minutes. If everyone would hold your questions till the end or put them in the chat. We hope to have time for a few questions. We probably won't have a lot of time, but that's the process we'll use. And it looks to me like everybody knows our drill of asking people to keep their audio muted and their cameras off until the end, perhaps, if you'd like. That's, I think, a little less distracting for everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started. John, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can see my part of the presentation here. My topic today is about distributed solar, and I have a definition of that's going to be important. But I think that as you ask questions, I think that we can begin to talk about all scales of solar, not only distributed, but large scale if you have questions, but the presentation is going to focus on distributed. And I think that this is an important distinction to understand because there really are very different kind of animals. And when we do economic analysis, they're very different. We use them for different things. So in my definition, the distributed solar is typically small scale, grid connected, usually behind the meter, is customer owned, so a business, a residence, a farm. The energy is used by the customer first, typically, and so they're saving some by generating some of their own. Utility scale is those large scale systems like the LES system west of Lincoln. It's utility or investor owned. It's grid connected, and the electricity flows to the grid and is sold to the marketplace of the grid. And so I heard that you learned some about the grid in recent times here, so that's going to be important. The solar from the distributed also might flow to the grid, but because it's behind the meter and is used first by the customer, the economics are calculated much differently. So just an important distinction between those two. Now, when we think about a residential or business system, why do people want solar? And I think this is a really important piece as well, where a person might want solar because it's green, because they have an interest in that environmental attribute of that solar energy, the fact that it doesn't give off as much carbon, and I have a slide on that in a moment. They may be interested in the tax credit that they can acquire. In a business, they can use some of that as depreciation, as again, another tax benefit. If it's a business, they might be marketing. So you can imagine going to a business that has maybe a solar array and they say, you know, we are a very environmentally conscious business. And you can see that they are because of their use of renewables. It could be because of just an economic reasons. I want to have this ongoing savings or this investment type of income. So there's different reasons they want them, but those are also kind of those positives. You also have the challenges, and I'm going to call it the cons in this case of residential business solar, which is that you have this initial cost. So yes, you have ongoing savings in many cases, but you had to pay almost all of that up front. So you had this large initial upfront cost. You also have then to keep up with operation and maintenance, which is low. They are very robust systems, but they do have operation and maintenance. And then we may not be able to regain that investment if we move. So if we sell the house, it may not increase the value of the house. I'm going to kind of juxtapose that with community solar, which LES has, but so does some other utilities. And there's pros and cons to that as well. Some of the same pros, green energy, but also you can participate without actually putting it on your residence or your place. You can sell it back if you move for a lower price, but you can still sell it back. So you have some of that. They're taking care of operation and maintenance, so there's low risk. Now, the cons are it may not be as economically good for you because you don't get the depreciation. Probably you don't get the tax credit. That is a maybe. I did see some situations where some community solar was working that out where the tax credit still did go to the system owner. And it's not your location for marketing purposes. So, to say that you're green, they'll say you don't have that visual attribute to say that you're green. So community solar has those pros and cons to it. I mentioned that solar is green energy. Well, here's some data that I put together. We're looking at some of the scientific literature that's out there. And this is a couple years old now, but it's still pretty good. So if we think about the generation of electricity, we can think about the emissions of that electricity in grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Remember, a kilowatt hour is worth about maybe 7 to 10 cents or 7 to 12 cents, maybe in Nebraska today. So we'll just round that to 10 for our discussion purposes. So for 10 cents worth of electricity, a coal-fired power plant gives off almost a kilogram of carbon dioxide. A natural gas power plant is 600, so not quite half of that. But you can see this is also why natural gas is considered much cleaner than coal. It gives off much less carbon dioxide for the same amount of energy generation. Combined cycle natural gas, which is using essentially that energy twice, is much lower at 400. There's a combined cycle natural gas plant in North Lincoln. Then Nebraska's generation mix in 2017 was 628. Again, 628 because it's a mix of coal, natural gas, wind, nuclear, hydro, solar, and it's a much small amount of solar. So, but it's a mix of all those, and because of that, it comes in at 628 grams. Solar PV utility scale is 6 to 14 grams. Now, you may be wondering, well, I thought solar was zero carbon. Well, if I draw the border around the solar panel itself, the solar panel didn't give off any carbon, but they had to make that solar panel and they had to transport it. And so in the construction and making of that solar panel and getting all those materials and getting it to that site, there are some emissions, and those add up across the lifetime of that solar panel at 6 grams to 14 grams of carbon dioxide. So it's very, very low, but it's not zero. Same is true for wind, 4 to 9. Nuclear is 4, and hydro is 97. And so you can see that when we really do think about low carbon things, we really ought to be thinking about these bottom 4 as the low carbon. But there's pros and cons to all of those as well. And to have a reliable grid, that mix of resources is important. And so that's the challenges we face. These are very green. When we think about solar and think about what they're made of, there really are 3 types of solar panels common to the industry today. And that is mono or monocrystalline silicon, polycrystalline silicon. And you can see the pictures at the top. Look at the one in the middle. The one in the middle, you can see the crystals within the silicon matrix. That's multiple crystals. And the way they made it, when it cooled, it formed crystals at random. And the monocrystalline, when they formed that crystal, they grew that crystal very large and sliced it so it's all a solid color. Thin film It's essentially almost, you can think about almost like a printing technology, but it's a much thinner technology. Let's go back. That's the one guy. But when it comes to efficiencies, the mono and the poly are much more efficient, thin film are less. Also, the mono and poly have very long lifespans in that 25 to 30 year range, with the thin film being less of a lifespan. So some people will say, well, it means I want mono. Well, maybe, maybe not. The polycrystalline tend to be a little lower cost at times. So between mono and poly, try to get the one that's the best cost. I don't think that there's necessarily a large reason to choose one over the other, unless you're limited in space, in which case you might go with the higher efficiency of the mono. They do cost a little bit more. There are some other chemistries out there: cadmium telluride, amorphous silicon, copper Indian gallium selenide, but they're less common than the silicon things. Now, I didn't bring a slide for this, but I will mention that these are made of silicon, which silicon is kind of like molten sand. There is a little bit of metals in there for the wire and things like that. And then the frames are made of aluminum. And that's really about it. So there's not a lot of things. So there really is some misnomers out there in the media saying that these have a lot of toxic substances. The silicon modules really don't have toxic substances that we are all that worried about. But the fact is that at the moment, there isn't a real big way to recycle these. But that's part of the imperfect nature of this particular energy system. Let's think about a house for a moment. And so I'm thinking about this house, and let's say that house is using electricity and it's the nighttime, and the electricity is coming from the grid and going into the home, and it's being metered and charged with my electric bill. The sun comes up. This inverter is turning the DC from the solar into grid quality AC. And now I'm sending electricity in this direction, and the house is using it instantaneously if there's enough load. Maybe I go to work, the solar panel is still generating, and some electricity travels from the solar panel out to the meter. That's essentially what's happening at any given moment in time, or even at any given second during the day when you have a solar array. All three of these things are happening. The general concept, though, is that if I'm using it, this one down here at the bottom, we'll call this, I don't know, we'll call this D. If we're using it, it is offsetting what we buy from the electrical grid. And we'll call this one A. So this is what we bought from the electrical grid, and this one is B. And so just a little lesson in net metering. The word net metering is the big important piece is net. And that is that at the end of the month, I'm going to take A and I'm going to subtract B to get a net amount. And that is the net in net metering. So if they're not doing that subtraction, it's not net metering. And so that's an important distinction on how net metering is done. And there is a state law for net metering in Nebraska. So let's go on and look. Some people are interested in batteries. I tend to try to convince people that batteries are probably not worth it in most cases because they're expensive and the grid is so reliable. We have very little need for that backup. So I don't really foresee a battery being an economic investment in most cases. But this is how it would work. This is a version of a system with a battery where I now have a different type of inverter, a battery-based inverter with a charge controller. And I could be, charging the battery. I could be running solar to the home. I could be running solar to the grid. I could be buying from the grid. I then also could be taking battery out of the solar or out of the battery and using it. But in the case of a blackout, I can open this disconnect and basically island the house from the grid, thus allowing me to then run this battery in an emergency situation to run the loads I've designated in my home. There's a couple different types of systems. This is a string inverter, and you can think of string because it's a string of solar panels on one large inverter. And so this is a system that's on a farm north of Lincoln. And we worked on installing this as part of a workshop a number of years ago, but this is a string inverter and a ground mount system. So we have two things going on here, a ground mount and a string inverter. So string inverters are the lowest cost, but because of the electric code, mainly we use string inverters for ground mounted systems. It's important to note this system is very pretty. There's no wires that are accessible and other things. Everything is in conduit, so that all meets electric code. This is a one in Lincoln that I have a friend that installs, and I helped him on part of this installation. So I took a picture while I was working on it. And so this is a roof mounted system, and under each one of these solar panels, there is a micro inverter. And that works well for roof mounted systems. It meets the electric code. And so that is a micro meaning basically one inverter for one solar panel in this case. So they work a little differently. They're a little more expensive, but they also have some advantages as well when it comes to shade and other things. Let's just think about the economics. And I think the economics is an important one, and I try to base a lot of my comments based on the economics. First of all, I have a gross system cost. This is essentially what you're writing the check for at the beginning. And it's the total amount that you got to write the check for. Then in your tax, in April, when you do your taxes, you can get 30% of that back as an investment tax credit. The federal government just renewed that for 10 more years for the residences. If you're a business, you can get depreciation, additional depreciation savings for that. You can't depreciate the whole 30% ITC, but part of it. There may be other incentives. This is where Lincoln Electric System has an incentive that's potentially available to you. Also, farms have the Rural Energy for America program grant that's possible that they could get. Renewable energy credits, if applicable, they're pretty difficult to access here in Nebraska, but in states that have some carbon trading schemes, like in the North and other things, like in the Northeast United States, those carbon credits can be valuable. And then finally, you have this balance of the initial investment or the net cost. What you've got to be wary about is that sometimes an installer will really just tell you this cost, and they will base all of their discussion on this cost. But it's a little challenging because then they're going to ask you to write a check for the gross amount. So it's important to know the difference between the net amount and the gross amount. And then finally, I'm going to try to eat away at that balance, that cost, with the ongoing savings. And so those ongoing savings are eventually going to pay off the system and then start saving me money. And so payback is what everybody wants to know. We're going to get to that in just a moment. This is a slide. It's from 2018. I looked in some newer numbers. They haven't changed a whole lot, so I left this slide in place at the moment. But this is simply saying that residential systems on kind of a national average, when they do some surveys, are costing about $2.70 per watt. So per watt of installed capacity. So if you had a 10 kW system, which is 10,000 watts, it would be $27,000. And so this is a total installed cost price. And so this can kind of give you some sense of kind of the middle of that road. In Nebraska, I think I'm seeing stuff more lately between maybe 240 and about 325. So it fits within this range of this 270 midpoint pretty well. The commercial, as you get a little bit larger, there are some economies of scale. So if this was a large farm or something like that, the installations can be less expensive because they're a little larger. And as we get to a utility scale, it goes down even more and actually might be in this range down here for utility scale of about $1 per watt. You can see, though, this is where the excitement takes place. Look at the decline in price over the last decade. It's been pretty impressive. I think it's flattening out some like this, but it definitely has still come down a lot since 2010. Let's get through some financial metrics and get to the money here, because it's important. Now, one of the challenges I see happening quite a bit in the market today is that installers are either not doing an economic analysis, or they're doing an economic analysis that's very rudimentary, and only a very few do a very high quality economic analysis. And some of that, there are their own reasons for doing that. But some of the things that need to be thought about in an economic analysis are the degradation, or the fact that that solar panel produces less over time. The shading. One of my biggest pet peeves is when a installer gives a quote and has never even looked at the house or seen that there's a tree there, and says, well, it's going to produce this many kilowatt hours. Well, wait a second, that tree is going to shade that solar panel for multiple hours a day. That production estimate is not very accurate. So I've seen that. Hopefully we're getting some of that cleared up over time. The value of electricity generated, we're trying to estimate the value of that. One of the challenges is to say that all of those kilowatt hours that solar generated are worth one price. Well, that's not always the case. And actually, in a number of cases, it's not the case. So if there could be a difference between whether that electricity went onto the grid or was used in the home, the net metering policies impacts how that works. But we need to get a more accurate value of the electricity generated. Also, the utility rate schedule. Lincoln Electric system charges more in the summer than they do in the winter. And so we need to take that into account when we are looking at the value of the electricity generated. Inflation of the price of electricity. We could call it inflation. Well, Lincoln Electric system has a 4.8% proposed increase, this year. Now that's 4% this year, and maybe they didn't for a couple of years. What I try to do is let's look at the average inflation across a longer period of time, which looks like in Nebraska has been about 1 to 1.5% inflation of the electricity price. The discount rate is an individual number for doing some economic analysis. And if you want to know more, we can discuss that later. But and then also the tax implications of the incentives. Can I take advantage of that tax credit? Can I use that depreciation? Are there utility incentives? Insurance and O&M. In some cases, insurance goes up, and we need to include that in our financial analysis. Also, if they have O&M as zero, it's not going to cost anything. Well, that's not the case. There is going to be costs. Hopefully they're minor, but there is cost. Even if you have to warranty out an inverter, you might have to pay the installer to do some of that work. Or if you break a solar panel because of a rock hitting it, then you have to just pay for that out of pocket. That's part of the operation and maintenance costs. Okay, everybody wants to know payback, and it's a good metric. But if you are a business, you really ought to be getting into the metric of net present value as a much better metric for looking at that. But payback is probably one of the more simple ones and easy to understand, and also is one that I'm going to report the most. So payback. These are some calculations I did last year. I left them on because they're reasonably accurate. But in Nebraska, in general, residential systems payback has been about 12 to 16 years in my calculations. There has been some that are outside of that, but most of them have fallen in that range. And commercial and agricultural are 9 to 14 years. That's part of the act of depreciation, allowing that to be lower because they can access the depreciation. So one time a person said, well, John, you should tell everybody that this isn't a good deal. And I said, well, I'm not going to tell people that it's not a good deal. I'm going to tell them the numbers and the economic analysis and let them decide for themselves. Because 12 years might be too long for one person and perfectly acceptable for another. And so we tend to let the data do the talking. Speaking of data doing the talking, I ran a residential example through a bunch of different scenarios. And we're getting to the end of my talk here, so we should have some time for questions. And so I'm going to talk about some of these. Let's do some of these. Let's look at this one. This is kind of the back of the envelope calculations. This is the one where you pull out your phone, you open the calculator app, you do a couple of numbers, and it's really rudimentary. And you throw it out and you say, oh, it's 13.5 years payback. I like doing that quite a bit, the back of the envelope calculation, because if that 13.5 years is way beyond where they're ready for to do it, maybe the discussion ends there. But if they say, well, 13.5 years, well, let's look at that a little closer. Then we can look at it in different ways. Now, this is one that I threw in some red flag things, like a 6% escalation in electricity prices every year. And so this is what happens sometimes is we can add elements to our analysis that really make this a illegitimate analysis. And so I've seen some that had some really poor ones that had, oh, this is a 5-year payback or a 2-year payback. No, I don't think so. There's something in there that is really probably a little bit too rosy. In this case, I put in a 6% escalation, 10.5-year payback. Everything looks great, but it's not likely going to happen. This is where I like to live, in this conservative assumptions area, where I'm trying to say, well, I'm going to have some cost of O&M, some cost of insurance, kind of a average inflation rate, things like that. And I was calculating 14.6 years on this particular analysis. Now, these last two on the left are a little bit weird, because there is a situation in Nebraska where if the system is over 25 kW, it doesn't qualify for net metering, or if the utility has met their 1% of net metered customers, they no longer have to net meter customers, in which case I ran a couple scenarios of how they could deal with that and how they could treat their customers. So one is, it is called net billing. It's a way where all the electricity that's going to the grid is being paid to the customer at a wholesale rate, and they are able to offset the electricity used instantaneously by their load. Is just an offset. And so that's 18.6 years payback. You can see that that's quite a bit longer. But this is where I'm a little concerned, is that there's a utility in Nebraska today that is putting in place a buy all, sell all, and charging $35 additionally per month to connect systems. The payback of that is over 50 years. Remember, it's not going to last 50 years. It's going to last 25 to 30. So this is way beyond its lifetime. Essentially, this payback is not payback. This is a negative or a loss. And this is I ran an existing policy at a utility in Nebraska. And so it is impossible for me today, in today's marketplace, to say in Nebraska, the paybacks are 12 to 16 years. Well, no, actually more like they're 12 to 50, over 50 years, because of the diversity of how these policies are being written. So that variability across the state is kind of a challenge. And I do ask people a lot when they say, I want to talk about solar. I say, well, let's first start by talking about where you live and who is your utility, because that's going to make a big difference. All right, I'm going to let our other speakers go and go to questions, but I want to let you know that we have some upcoming solar workshops if you want to know more or get a more detailed look at this. And those are across the state. There's one in Lincoln on December 1st. If you, the bioenergy at UNL, there is a link to the registration there. It does cost $10. We're keeping that cost down because we have some sponsorship from some of the utilities in Nebraska. And we'd love to see you there. I'm also willing to answer questions for you. This is some of the steps in the process, but I wanted to kind of, we can go back to that if we need to, but because I think Mark might talk about some of that. I wanted to show you my system really quick, just to finish. I installed my system on the south side of my garage. This is the crew I hired. They were a little bit novice. And so actually, this is the person that did all the work. This is how it was coming together. And we're framing that up for the roof area, putting on the rails, getting ready to put the solar on. The solar panels go on. Mine does have a string inverter on a roof, but that's because mine was installed under the 2014 electric code. You need to be a little different under the 2017 electric code, but it was installed under the 2014 code. And this solar array is 4.4 kW and runs 60% of my house on an annual basis. This is the inverter as we were installing the inverter with the DC going in and the AC going out. We were installing the disconnect. That's a requirement from the utility. And there it's all turned on and looks all pretty with conduit. There's the shut off. Now this is prior to having we have some labels, some safety labels that were put on those that got put on after the picture. So this is my production across since 2017. It was turned on in February 2017. And then the current month we're in is November, and we're still going up. But you can see there is some variability across that. But at the same time, it's actually been very consistent annually across the year. But you have months, probably the most variable month is February. You can imagine this February was the best I ever had. And the worst I ever had, I would say, was 2021. But what happens is it snows in February, and then the snow covers it for as many as 1 to 3 weeks of February, and I lose some production. So there's some variability. I am on track to have the best year I ever had. That is a good thing for my solar, but a bad thing for the drought issues in Nebraska, because what happens is it didn't rain, thus we didn't have very many cloudy days, thus the sun was good, and I had good production. And so it was a good year in 2022. But you can just see my kind of my production over time. If you have any questions, this is how I can be reached. And I'll stop sharing and let Mark take over.
John, thank you very much. I have to tell you, with the workforce issues that can you all see my screen, by the way? Can you see the website?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I was just going to say, John, with the workforce issues, you have to take anybody you can get. So those little munchkins that were out there helping you put that system in, sometimes you can't be choosy in this labor force environment, right?
That's right. That's right. They fit under the child labor laws. It was okay.
You want to make sure that was mentioned. Well, thank you. Lori, thank you for hosting this. I'm really overwhelmed that we have so many folks online. I think I saw there's over 30 folks. This is a really interesting and exciting topic for many. And it's great that there's that much interest in that we have this opportunity to talk through the different aspects of looking at solar. As John pointed out, so many good points in his presentation. I always take mental notes every time I listen to it, because there's always something, oh yeah, I need to remember that too. We're really lucky to have John. He is an expert of experts in this area, and the way he presents, it's just very well done. And so the fact of the matter is, as John mentioned, when you get into a solar system, this is not an inexpensive venture. It's like buying a fairly low-cost new car, basically. You're talking oftentimes $25,000 to $30,000. Now, you might be able to knock some of that down with tax credits and incentives and things, but I can tell you I've approved systems that well exceed $30,000 recently. So it's something that a person needs to know all the aspects, consider the questions to ask. There's a variety of different installers out there, and there are many very reputable installers. Unfortunately, there are many very disreputable, that's a word, but they're not looking out for your best interest. And so that's going to be part of my message here, is how do you make sure that you're getting good information, good factual information to base the decision on. So here is les.com, because that's really what I wanted to indicate, is we've got resources for you here. And on our website, we've got a whole web page from our homepage at les.com devoted to solar. And I was going to walk you through some of these resources. Now, we do have information about the community solar, which John mentioned, which tend to work for those who, they're renting an apartment, right? So you really don't have a lot of options when you're renting an apartment. So you might look at, you want to participate in solar, you can participate in the virtual net metering program. Or else you may have a house that is shaded considerably or is not facing south, or you don't necessarily want to have a solar system on your roof. These are options then that you might consider virtual net metering. But there's plenty of customers that would like to consider putting solar on their roof. So that's where we come down here, and we've got a couple of sections of this site, this page. One is for customers, and the other is for our solar contractors and installers. And I want to talk a little bit about what we have here available for view for customers. We had a webinar earlier this year called Shedding the Light on Solar, and it gets into some of the points that John made, although I think John really went into some good detail here. Shedding the Light on Solar is going to talk a little bit more about some of the questions to ask installers and that type of thing. So this is a webinar that you can watch, and it's about 45 minutes or so in length, and I invite you to consider viewing that. And then we put together a buyer's checklist. And I do want to open this and show you what's available here. This is available for you to download, to print, but it essentially is a variety of things to consider, questions to ask installers, rules of thumb when it comes to solar. And one of the items here has to do with rates. As John pointed out, LES has asked for a 4.8% rate increase to take effect January 1st. It's pending City Council approval. What's interesting, though, about that 4.8% increase for residential customers is that the energy component, the actual energy component, would only go up 2%. So you may hear a 4.8% increase, but if you're generating solar and you're getting paid for energy, you want to look at what's the energy rate, the energy component. That under this rate increase would only go up 2%. That means that the rest of that 2.8% would be on the fixed costs that you will be assessed, irregardless of how much energy you consume. And this confuses a lot. This confuses a lot of people. Number one, it's important to understand the fixed cost, those customer and facility charges, pay for the infrastructure that's required to provide you with reliable power 24/7, 365, regardless of whether the sun is shining, the wind is blowing. So oftentimes what we've seen is some installers will say that the energy rate is 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, they're including the fixed customer and facility charge in that. And that won't necessarily be impacted when you put solar on your roof. So you really want to look at the energy rate. And our energy rate is around 7 cents a kilowatt hour. We tend to be towards the low end of the state average, because John was saying it was in the 7 to 10 cent range, maybe a little higher. LES's energy rate tends to be at the lower end of the spectrum on that. So this sheet shows that, or this document suggests making sure that you have good energy efficiency throughout your home, because you don't necessarily want to generate more energy than you need to. So your solar system may actually be smaller if you tighten up your home, if you use energy efficient heat pumps or air conditioners, high efficient units, if you use heat pump water heating, efficient appliances. You can actually reduce the amount of energy, electric energy you need, which means you may be able to get by with a smaller solar system to meet your needs. There's other rules of thumb about the tilt of the ideal tilt of the solar system, the direction, of course, southerly being the most preferred. There's some other rules of thumb here in terms of what you can typically expect per kilowatt of energy production annually, assuming that it's southerly and unshaded. Again, John pointed that out. It needs to be unshaded and it needs to be facing south. It also talks about what you can expect for the most part for energy rates going into the future. It's the great unknown, but that rate increase we had is the first one in, I believe, 4 or 5 years. We had no rate increase. And in fact, our energy rate has actually gone down and our fixed charge has gone up a little bit as we've moved some of the fixed costs out of the energy rate. So those are things that you need to keep in mind. But this document provides a lot of good questions to ask, some additional tools. And so when a customer comes to us, or a contractor on behalf of a customer comes to us to apply for net metering installation, we'll ask that the customer review and sign and acknowledge that they reviewed this document as part of the net metering approval process if they wish to get that capacity payment. It is not a requirement of state statute that a customer review this. It is not a requirement of net metering, but it is a requirement if the customer wants to get the LES incentive. It is part of the process. So let's go back to the web page here. And the next item here is a list of solar trade allies that are part of LES's Solar Trade Ally Network. This is the network that we kicked off January 1st. And one of the main reasons that we launched this network is we were seeing a couple of really bad actors out there going door to door, selling solar, falsely suggesting that LES was partnering with them, falsely representing our rates as much higher than they are, falsely indicating that rates would go up energy rates would go up 3 to 5% a year, and a variety of other things that were deceiving. And what we decided to do is basically say, look, our LES capacity payment incentive is something that we provide, but we're going to condition all that incentive for only those projects installed by installers, by contractors that will agree to acknowledge that they will only provide factual information to customers. And so what we do is, and we're about ready to have another orientation in December, is we invite all the installers to attend an orientation. We run through all the facts about our rates, about our incentives, about the interconnection process, all of it. And then they sign an acknowledgement saying that they acknowledge that they're going to represent factual information to customers. And then they are listed here. We are not endorsing them. We are not certifying them. There are further certifications that they can achieve. But all we're saying is this group of trade allies here have gone through the orientation, and they have signed an acknowledgement that they will provide factual information. And if they don't have an answer to a question, they'll call us, right? That's what you want to do. You want to work with reputable firms that are going to not make things up and not mislead, especially on an investment of this magnitude. So this is the group that is part of this network. And so it does kind of serve as a resource for customers, because a lot of times you have no idea who you'd even reach out to. And we always suggest consider reaching out to more than one, because you are kind of like car shopping. You might want to compare prices and compare features and see where you're going to get the best, the best situation for you. And then there is additional information available that gets into the actual application for interconnection and that type of thing. But oftentimes the contractor will do that on behalf of the customer and make it a pretty good service that they can provide. So essentially, that's what I wanted to mention in terms of the resources we have available. I will point out that the solar contractors are required to participate in an orientation, as I mentioned before. I do want to show you real quick before I end here what we do ask the contractor to sign, so you're aware of it. They need to participate in the meeting that goes through our rates and our interconnection process. They need to sign the acknowledgement form. The customer needs to sign that checklist. And then we say, we're going to provide you, we're going to list you on the network list. And then it gets into some of the details of what are they agreeing? What are they acknowledging that they're going to do? That they're going to provide good factual information. Well, if you're interested in the fine print, it's all right here for you to look at. And if for some reason we do find that a member of this network is promoting falsely, is misleading customers, is misrepresenting rates, they will cease to be a member of the network, and their projects will no longer qualify for an incentive. So there is a bit of a carrot and stick approach here. So it's our ongoing effort as a public power entity to kind of help look out for customers, because very few people understand what a kilowatt of solar should cost. Very few people understand how a lot of this works. It's very technical. And so there are installers that can take advantage of that and use it for nefarious purposes. And I've seen customers get into long-term loan contracts that are in a real dire strait. Fortunately, as I said, we've got some good installers here, and we need to make sure that we're working with those folks and asking the right and the good questions. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Lori.
Great. Thank you so much, both Mark and John. Wow, you guys are really good. We are right on time. So if there are questions, I guess I'm not seeing any in the chat, but if there are questions, I invite people to turn on their audio and video if they like and ask away. And while we're waiting for that, John, I have actually two questions for you. Very first step, if you think to yourself, gee, I wonder if I could put solar on my house or barn or small building. What's the first thing if you're just going to go out and walk around your property, what is it you're looking for?
Yeah, and I think Mark mentioned that clearly the first thing you always want to do is any energy efficiency things in your house that you can do. Those are the low hanging fruit. If you haven't insulated more, if you haven't, those are the low hanging fruit. But as you're thinking about solar, you're looking for south facing areas. This could be a roof face that's south facing. It also could be a ground area where you can put a ground mount system. So we're looking for that area. We're looking for an area that probably doesn't have a lot of trees. A tree or a few trees, you might lose 5–10% of production. That may not be terrible. But if you're going to lose a lot more than that because of trees, then you can ask yourself, is this tree a long-term tree or isn't it? I'm not a proponent of cutting down trees. But if the tree is a short-term tree, the tree is not healthy or something like that, then you could say, well, you can have those other things. So take a walk around, look for those south facing. Now, some people don't have south facing, they have east or west. If I put it on the east or the west, I'm going to lose about 15% annual production because of it, because I'm only getting more morning sun and middle day and not in the evening, or vice versa. Now, under the LES guidelines, if you put it on the west, you may be able to access some of their subsidy. If you put it on the east, you don't get it, because they need the electricity in the afternoon, not in the morning. So you just be thinking about those things. And it's not necessarily always a deal breaker to put it on the east or the west. It just changes the analysis a little bit because the production goes down on an annual basis. Now, the other thing I want to kind of throw out is that a system, one of the ideas that comes up is that my house uses 10,000 kilowatt hours. I need to generate 10,000. That's not the way I look at it. What I would like to see is that a good starting point is starting at about 50%. That's kind of where the sweet spot for economics is. But if you want to be fully green, getting closer to 100% may be what you want, but the economics tend to get a little bit worse as we approach 100%.
Okay. Melissa, do you, my colleague Melissa Landis is going to help us with some questions here. So Melissa, I'm seeing a few things pop up in the chat.
Yeah, there sure are. First question is, how or where a person could purchase just 3 to 4 panels, sort of a small purchase or small installation?
Yeah, let's talk through that, and maybe I'll start and Mark can add. There's a number of installers that will help you with a small system. Now, the cost per watt goes up, but the overall cost is still low because it's small. And that can work for a small house or something like that. Now, if you're thinking about just buying 3 or 4 panels to then do a DIY is possible, but we got to be very careful with understanding the electric code and following the electric code. And so it's nice to have studied up or have some help with that. But let's say you're an electrician and you know the electric code well, or you know there are some possibilities of doing that. You can get online and buy panels and inverters and all the parts. But I also considered, think about some of those local installers, see if the price they can get is better. Sometimes they have wholesale markets and they can get some good prices and maybe give you some advice in the process. So just some thoughts on that 3 to 4 panel purchase.
Looks like we have another question from Larry about the roof mounts and how those might impact the longevity or the life of his roof.
Yeah. Okay. The fact is that it's a little bit of a pain to put a solar array on a roof and then have to replace the roof. You take the solar off, you fix the roof, you put the solar back on. It's a little bit of a pain. It's doable. It's just a little bit of a pain. I've helped do it at least one time. And so what a lot of installers that I talk to tend to say is that it's really nice to have a newer roof. Under 5 years old probably is a decent one. Even brand new to 5 years old, that's a good roof to put it on, because that roof has a long life, the solar has a long life, and hopefully you don't have to do it unless there's an emergency situation like a storm, and you have hail damage to your roof and you have to replace it, and then you just suck it up and it gets fixed with your insurance. I think there was a second question about that I'm going to add to that. There's a durability question of solar panels. And I'll simply answer that by saying that these solar panels generally are more durable than your roof is durable. They are tougher than an asphalt shingle roof. And in many cases, I've seen that the roof does not survive the hailstorm, but the solar panels do. I was once in a room with about 10 installers, and they were asked the hail question. And of all the systems they have installed, they could add up the broken panels to 7. And so they do break sometimes, but they're pretty durable. And they're rated at I can't remember the whole detail, something like a hailstone of a certain size at 50 miles an hour at 90 degrees. And the reality is most of the time that hail is not at that 90-degree angle. So they're pretty tough and they survive pretty well. I've had to replace 2 solar panels because they were ground mounted and we drove a shredder too close to. This is at a research farm. We drove a shredder too close and threw rocks at them and broke them. Yeah, we screwed up and we had to replace those. They were not durable enough to handle the rock thrown at.
Also, staying on the topic of roofs, it sounds like maybe Omaha has a requirement that the roof be certified as structurally sound or certified by a structural engineer before the solar panels can be installed. Wondering if Lincoln has a similar requirement or has considered one, and the Omaha engineering requirement is an additional expense that has to be paid for by the home. Anything like that in Lincoln, or are you aware of them considering those sorts of requirements?
Mark, you want to jump on that one? Otherwise, I can.
No, yeah, I honestly, I don't have any information on that. I don't believe, I'm not sure about the structural engineering requirements on residential.
I can tell you what I was told from one of the installers that I know and think he was correct on, and that is that the city of Lincoln essentially has decided that if it is a residential structure, they're not needing additional engineering requirements. But if this is an additional structure, so in this case, think about I've got a house and I'm going to add a pergola or something to it and put solar on the pergola. We probably have to have some engineering done for that. If it is a ground mount structure or a roof mount for that matter, the companies that make the racking have engineering requirements that are good for every state. And what you end up doing is going through there and telling it where it is. And it'll say you need this many connections this far apart based on the wind and snow loading of your area. But the city of Lincoln doesn't require that, as I understand. But it is worth it probably to check that, but I think they do not. And so maybe that's a little bit of a challenge in Omaha, the added cost and just a hurdle that has to be jumped through.
Are there more questions from anybody in the audience? And if you're putting it in the chat, or if you'd like to go ahead and open up your audio and video, that's fine. John, I'll ask you another question while people are thinking. So I know this is something that Mark talks about as well, that the first thing is to make sure that whatever property you've got is energy efficient and well insulated and you know, some of those kinds of things. But what about, so as you're evaluating where you're going to spend your money, are small wind installations part of the mix as well when people are thinking about if they want their own system at home? I know around town you see the small wind turbines on, I've seen them on some convenience stores and some other properties in Lincoln.
Mark, let me take this one.
I could take it too, but I think you'll probably answer the.
Let me start, and I'm going to be. The answer is small wind an option? The answer is definitively no. 98% of the time, no. All those little wind turbines in Lincoln that you see on, they are all junk. And they are not necessarily junk because they have what they are. They're junk because of what they are and where they are. You put in town, there's not a good wind. There's not a good enough wind. They're too expensive. They have high maintenance. A number of them in Lincoln are of design that is inherently inefficient. I tried to get data from one of those in Lincoln one time, the ones that are by the old mall. After 4 years, the guy at LES at the time says, John, quit asking. They've never generated any power. And so the answer is no. Now, I said 98% of the time, there are some opportunities for small wind. If you are out in the country, you're willing to put them on a tall tower. There's a very limited number of companies that make good turbines. So you got to be doing a lot of research, though really we're limiting down to there's not hardly but one company now that makes a good small wind turbine. So the answer is small wind turbines is almost always no, with a few minor exceptions for out in the country, not in town. Stay away from it. I have a video that's 17 minutes long about the laws of physics regarding wind turbines. That video will talk you out of them.
Okay, very good.
And
Well, it's good to have a definitive answer. Go ahead, Melissa.
Looks like we have one last question, maybe, that a person asks whether during a power outage, could they disconnect from the utility and run the house off their solar system?
John, you can add to what I'm about to say, but generally no. The inverters are actually, according to IEEE, which is one of the standards and requirements, that a inverter shuts down when it senses no voltage coming in. And that is to protect linemen and the system from backfeeding. And so when you just have a straight solar array, it is not a backup source of energy. And I will tell you, there are some installers out there that we've heard saying that this is a way to maintain the lights on when the power goes out. which is a real trick if it happens at night, isn't it? But in any event, even if it's during the day, the inverter will shut down. There will be no generation. And again, that's for system protection and the protection of crews. John, do you want to add anything?
I will no, I agree with that completely. I will simply add that if a battery is added,
Right, that's different.
there is opportunity, but the cost of the system goes way up.
And then you need a transfer switch. You need an improved transfer switch that would allow that. And generally it'll be a manual switch, but you'll need another switch to make sure that there is no backfeed with a battery.
I will add one minor caveat, and that is that my system, in the case, and I just wired it the other day, this deal that I'm talking about, my system has, it's a little gimmicky, called a secure power supply. In the case of a power outage, I go out to my disconnect, I throw the disconnect, completely disconnecting my solar array from the grid, so there's no way to backfeed. At which time then I turn on a switch on my inverter, and my inverter will run one outlet that is completely separate from the grid.
Yeah.
During
That's
the time
that's very isolated.
during the time that there's sun, I can run one outlet. Okay.
Hopefully the refrigerator.
Now, I am excited about this. If and when I have a 2 or 3 day power outage, my freezers will stay frozen. But I haven't had a 3-day power outage since 2004 in Pierce. So I don't expect to have a multi-day power outage. But if I would, I have that one outlet. It's not a backup, but it's something.
Okay, very good. Well, I think we'll leave it there. And a huge thanks to John and to Mark for your excellent presentation. We really appreciate it. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the climate action page of the First-Plymouth website, probably early to mid next week. You'll find there also last week's presentation, which I recommend to you, is excellent. It was a broad overview of electricity generation in Nebraska, particularly Lincoln Electric System, including renewable sources, the regional Southwest Power Pool, and balancing cost, reliability, and sustainability, presented by Scott Benson with LES. And it also includes a brief review of recent legislative efforts to restrict public utilities' responsiveness to their customer owners, presented by Ken Winston, a Lincoln attorney practicing environmental policy law and a member of the climate action team. In early January, looking ahead, the climate action team is planning to offer a how-to session on advocacy, including how to contact an elected or appointed official and what to say, how to write a letter to the editor or guest column and get it published, and how to talk to friends and family about climate change and other important issues of the day. Our how-to session will be tilted toward climate change, but the skills we'll be focusing on will be useful regardless of whatever issues you're concerned about. You can watch for details of this starting in December. And again, that program will be in early January. And now I just want to say a final thank you to Mark and to John, and thank you to members of our audience for joining us this evening. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Thank you.
Bye.